In the darkened halls of a royal palace, where whispers traveled faster than truth, a young boy once carried the weight of a crown he was never allowed to wear. His name has been nearly erased by time, but his story, tragic and merciless, still echoes like a haunting. He was a prince, a rightful heir, the fragile embodiment of continuity for a troubled dynasty. Yet to his uncle, he was not a child but an obstacle, an innocent figure standing between ruthless ambition and absolute power. The story of this heir is not one of coronations and triumphs, but of betrayal, captivity, and torture so cruel it seems almost unthinkable. His uncle, once a protector, became executioner, twisting the bonds of blood into a weapon. This is not simply a tale of monarchy. It is the brutal reminder of how far men will go to grasp a throne, even if it means murdering their own kin. The kingdom into which the young heir was born was one already teetering on the edge of collapse. For decades, power had been a fragile arrangement, maintained not through unity but through fear, intimidation, and shifting alliances. The throne was less a symbol of stability and more a coveted seat of war, where each new ruler had to fight harder than the last to maintain control. Court factions constantly schemed in secret chambers, plotting strategies not of governance, but of survival. Nobles distrusted one another, generals wavered in loyalty, and even family ties were no longer a shield against betrayal. A child heir in such a world was both blessing and curse. He represented hope for continuity, but his youth made him vulnerable, a pawn that others could easily manipulate or destroy. Succession in this realm was never smooth. With each king's death, whispers of illegitimacy or conspiracy arose, and blood was spilled to secure the crown. When the boy was declared heir, the court split into two factions, those who believed his ascension would preserve the dynasty, and those who feared that his minority would plunge the kingdom into chaos. Hovering above all of this was his uncle, a man of sharp wit, practiced deceit, and unrelenting hunger for power. Outwardly, he played the loyal guardian, the concerned elder relative who would defend the young heir's interests until the boy was old enough to rule. Behind closed doors, however, he seethed with resentment. He saw not a beloved nephew, but a fragile obstacle standing between himself and the throne. The kingdom's instability provided the perfect environment for his ambitions. Civil unrest smoldered like hidden embers, waiting for a gust of betrayal to set the land ablaze. With rival nobles whispering about the boy's weakness, and with soldiers more loyal to coin than crown, the uncle began laying the foundation of his plan. He would first isolate the heir from allies, then manipulate the court into silence, and finally, he would remove the boy entirely. For the people beyond palace walls, rumors of conflict at court became daily gossip. Markets buzzed with tales of poisoned cups, of secret midnight councils, of a king who might never truly sit on his throne. Fear, more than loyalty, held the kingdom together. But beneath that fragile calm, the heir's doom was already being written, one decision at a time, one betrayal after another, as the uncle positioned himself for the final, bloody act. The child prince had been born amid great expectations. The bells of the capital rang loudly on the day of his birth, their echoes carrying promises of renewal and strength. He was seen as a fragile but crucial answer to the prayers of a weary dynasty, one that had endured assassinations, failed campaigns, and internal rivalries. From the beginning, he was raised in an environment that treated him as both a treasure and a target. Every step he took was guarded, every word he spoke was weighed by advisors. Even his playtime was observed by watchful eyes, as though danger lurked in every shadow. To the people, he was a beacon of hope, the boy who might one day unify a fractured realm. To those in power, however, he was a pawn whose birthright threatened to block their own ambitions. The heir's innocence made him endearing. Courtiers would describe his smile, his curiosity, his trust in those around him. But these same traits also exposed his vulnerability. He believed in the promises of protection offered by his uncle, unaware that behind the gentle reassurances lay a mind already calculating his downfall. The boy's symbolic power was immense. His very existence secured the legitimacy of the dynasty. He carried in his veins the bloodline that rival factions sought either to protect or destroy. As long as he lived, he stood as a barrier against those who wished to claim the throne by force. And for his uncle, this was intolerable. The uncle understood that the throne could never be truly his while the boy remained alive. Even if the heir was too young to rule directly, regents and loyal nobles would govern in his name. The uncle would forever be relegated to a supporting role, his power limited by a child he considered weak and unworthy. This sense of frustration only grew as the boy's popularity increased. Stories of his gentle nature spread among the people, and many nobles rallied behind him, convinced that under his eventual reign the kingdom might see peace. Each public cheer for the heir was a dagger to his uncle's pride. Each whispered promise of loyalty to the boy deepened the uncle's sense of exclusion. The child's birthright, meant to be his shield, became instead his curse. The very crown promised to him from birth painted a target on his back. He was trapped in a game he could not understand, where even bedtime stories and mourning lessons were interwoven with the politics of survival. And yet, in his innocence, he trusted those who smiled at him, trusted the uncle who tucked him in with soft words. But the throne was not built on trust. It was built on blood, betrayal, and ambition. And for one ambitious uncle, the boy's future was not to rule, but to suffer. From the moment the young heir was old enough to understand words, the uncle worked tirelessly to embed himself into the boy's trust. He wore the mask of protector, of loving guardian, performing a role so convincingly that even the most skeptical courtiers were deceived. He read bedtime stories with exaggerated care, attended lessons pretending to guide the prince in letters and numbers, and smiled warmly when the boy asked questions about the kingdom. Yet behind every gesture lay calculation. The uncle meticulously mapped out allies and adversaries, identifying those who might protect the heir and those who could be manipulated to silence. Every act of kindness was designed to lull the boy into complacency, every soft word intended to suppress suspicion. He planted seeds of doubt subtly among the court, whispering that the boy's tutors and advisors were not truly loyal. The court, eager to maintain stability, accepted the uncle's performance at face value. He controlled access to the heir, ensuring that no adult could develop a bond strong enough to counter his influence. Friends of the boy were carefully monitored, visits scheduled under his watchful eye, and messages filtered through him first. At night, when palace corridors were empty and torches flickered against stone walls, the uncle would pause and examine his strategy. Each maneuver, each whispered threat to potential dissenters, was calculated. He knew that direct confrontation would alert the boy and the court, so he relied on secrecy, patience, and manipulation. Even the heir's own education was weaponized. Tutors instructed him in history, etiquette, and statecraft, but the uncle subtly altered lessons to foster obedience and dependency. Stories of heroes emphasized loyalty to family above all, and narratives glorified patience and submission, shaping the boy's moral compass to fit the uncle's designs. By the time the boy reached an age where he could grasp the dynamics of the throne, he was already isolated emotionally. His confidence had been eroded, replaced by deference and trust in the very man who plotted his undoing. The uncle's deception was complete. He had created a prince who would never suspect that the man closest to him was the architect of his impending suffering. The court remained unaware, believing the uncle's intentions were noble. But shadows in the palace whispered otherwise. Servants caught fleeting moments of cruelty disguised as discipline. Minor injuries appeared mysteriously and were quietly attributed to the boy's clumsiness. All these signs pointed to the same terrifying truth. The young heir's world was not safe, and the person who smiled at him most warmly was preparing to betray him in ways unimaginable. The heir's innocence, his trust, and his birthright, all were being weaponized against him, turning the very palace meant to protect him into a cage of fear and suffering. The young heir's first true encounter with suffering came quietly, almost imperceptibly, masked as routine discipline. At first, the punishments were mild, a stern lecture, a temporary denial of toys, or being confined to a chamber for an hour. But these minor reprimands were carefully designed to test boundaries, to measure his resilience and his response to fear. The boy, too young to comprehend the larger plot, accepted them as part of palace life, trusting his uncle implicitly. Soon, however, the punishments escalated. The boy began to notice a pattern. Missteps, even accidental ones, were met with disproportionate consequences. A mispronounced word during lessons led to hours of silent confinement, seated on the cold stone floor, his tiny hands bound. A spilled cup of water triggered repeated kneeling with harsh commands to remain still, enduring cold and exhaustion. These early incidents left subtle psychological scars, teaching him that errors could bring unbearable suffering. The uncle's cruelty was never overtly visible to outsiders. To the court, he maintained his image as the doting guardian, often seen correcting the boy's posture, guiding his hand during lessons, or whispering praise in public. Privately, however, he implemented systematic methods of torment. He introduced minor physical discomforts, tight bindings, cold water, or prolonged exposure to drafty halls. Each action was calculated to condition the boy, to demonstrate that his safety and comfort were entirely in the uncle's hands. The young heir's emotions began to fluctuate unpredictably. Moments of joy, laughter, and curiosity became fleeting, often interrupted by sudden anxiety or fear of unseen consequences. Courtiers noticed the change, though many dismissed it as the normal temperament of a sensitive child in a high-pressure environment. But those closest to him, tutors, servants, and companions, could see the creeping shadow of distress, the way he flinched at sudden movements or withdrew from affectionate gestures. Sleep offered no respite. Nights were filled with dread, as the boy imagined the punishments he might face for imagined transgressions. The uncle's manipulations extended even into dreams, through whispered threats before bed or the careful placement of objects meant to inspire caution and fear. Each night ended with the boy praying for safety, unaware that the very person entrusted with his protection was the source of his mounting terror. The first signs of physical torment soon appeared. Subtle bruises, small abrasions, and the occasional bloodied knuckle hinted at the growing severity of the uncle's methods. Yet the boy's trust remained intact, reinforced by the uncle's cunning explanations and the unwavering display of kindness to outsiders. This duality, tenderness in public, cruelty in private, trapped the boy in a cycle of confusion and dependency. These initial experiences planted the seeds of what would become a prolonged nightmare. The young heir was learning, under the guise of education and discipline, that power could be wielded through fear, that love and suffering could coexist in terrifying proximity, and that survival required navigating an ever-present threat from the very person meant to guide him. What began as subtle torment quickly escalated into outright brutality. By now, the young heir had learned that every action, no matter how small, could trigger punishment. The uncle's methods became increasingly severe, designed to break both body and spirit. Public displays of control became rare. The cruelty was now confined to the private chambers, making it invisible to the court and reinforcing the child's isolation. The boy's daily routine became a carefully orchestrated cycle of instruction and punishment. Lessons in politics, etiquette, and warfare were interspersed with physical trials. Miss a lesson or answer incorrectly, and the consequences were swift and merciless. The uncle introduced instruments of pain, rods, belts, and restraints, under the guise of teaching discipline. Each strike left not only marks on the skin, but a deepening imprint on the mind. The heir began to associate authority with fear, obedience with survival. Hunger and sleep deprivation were added to the regimen. Meals were withheld for minor infractions, forcing the boy to endure gnawing hunger while observing others eat. Nights were interrupted by sudden awakenings, harsh commands, or forced postures that left his limbs sore and his mind fogged with exhaustion. The physical strain compounded the psychological torment, creating a relentless cycle that left him perpetually anxious and weakened. Witnesses, if they existed, were powerless. The uncle's calculated public persona shielded his actions from scrutiny. Tutors and attendants who suspected abuse faced the threat of dismissal, or worse, if they intervened. The court remained oblivious, seeing only the boy's growing maturity and solemnity, unaware that these traits were the result of terror, not wisdom. The heir's relationships began to suffer. Fear replaced trust, and affection became dangerous. Attempts at play or conversation were met with suspicion or punishment, teaching the boy that human connection could bring harm. Even the most loyal servants were forced to navigate a landscape of fear, ensuring they neither comforted nor contradicted the uncle in ways that might provoke further punishment. Isolation became both a protection and a prison. Psychological scars deepened. The boy developed hypervigilance, scanning rooms for potential threats, anticipating punishments that were often arbitrary. Moments of joy became fleeting and suspect. Even praise from the uncle was tinged with anxiety, for he never knew whether it signaled temporary favor or a precursor to harsher trials. The child's innocence was eroding, replaced by a calculating awareness of danger and the need for constant caution. By this stage, the brutality was no longer hidden in mere discipline. It had become a tool of domination. The young heir's spirit, resilience, and childhood were all being systematically stripped away. The boy was learning that survival demanded submission, that love and trust were weapons wielded against him, and that the very walls of the palace, meant to shelter him, were instead complicit in his suffering. This rise of brutality would define the trajectory of the young heir's life. The foundations laid in these years of relentless torment would shape his decisions, his fears, and ultimately the tragic fate that awaited him, a fate that history would later record in whispers and fragmented accounts, hinting at the horrors behind the gilded facade of royalty. The cruelty inflicted upon the young heir was not limited to physical punishment. A far more insidious form of torment emerged: psychological warfare. The uncle, fully aware that fear could be a far more effective weapon than pain alone, meticulously manipulated the boy's mind, twisting reality into a labyrinth of terror. Every word, every glance, every shadow in the room became a potential threat. The heir was trapped in a world where trust was fatal, and obedience was the only path to survival. Routine interactions with attendants, tutors, and even siblings were carefully monitored. The uncle would stage subtle tests, observing the boy's reactions to fabricated scenarios. Were his eyes too wide with fear or too calm with defiance? Did his hands tremble at the correct moment? Any deviation invited consequences. These exercises instilled a perpetual state of hypervigilance, where the young heir's mind became a constant battlefield. Paranoia was no longer occasional. It became the lens through which he viewed every interaction. Isolation intensified the psychological torment. The boy was denied normal companionship, stripped of peers, friends, or anyone who might offer comfort. Letters from allies were intercepted or doctored, reinforcing the message that no one could be trusted. Even the palace walls, meant to shield him, became instruments of confinement and surveillance. The heir internalized a profound sense of vulnerability. Every corridor might conceal danger, every servant might betray him, and every shadow might hide a punishment yet to come. Manipulation of affection became another tool. Praise and kindness were metered like currency, given sparingly and unpredictably. When the uncle smiled or offered a rare compliment, it was laden with ulterior motive, often preceding further punishment. The boy's emotional responses were no longer genuine. They became calculated acts of survival. He learned to mask fear, to feign confidence, to anticipate cruelty before it arrived. Innocence was gradually stripped away, replaced by a hyper-aware, constantly calculating mind. Sleep, too, was weaponized. Dreams, once a refuge, turned into a continuation of waking fear. The boy awoke trembling, anticipating pain, humiliation, or betrayal. The psychological impact was cumulative, eroding his resilience while instilling a dependence on the uncle as the sole source of guidance, however twisted it had become. By the midpoint of this campaign of terror, the heir's identity began to fragment. Childlike curiosity, joy, and spontaneity were replaced with caution, suspicion, and anxiety. Memory became selective. Moments of relief were fleeting and tainted by the anticipation of the next trial. The uncle's strategy was ruthless, shaped the boy's psyche to ensure unquestioning obedience, leaving no room for rebellion or hope. This relentless psychological assault laid the groundwork for the tragic events to come. History would later record the boy's demise as tragic and shocking, but the origins of that tragedy were carefully hidden in the shadows of the palace, etched into his mind long before his body succumbed. The final, irreversible turn in the young heir's life came not from direct violence, but from betrayal, an act so calculated and cold that it shattered all remaining hope. The uncle, having spent years meticulously eroding the boy's trust in allies and companions, orchestrated a situation where even the most loyal attendants became unwitting instruments of doom. Every interaction was a trap, every promise a lie, and the heir, conditioned to obedience and suspicion, had little chance to see it coming. It began with subtle manipulations. Servants and minor officials, carefully bribed or coerced, reported fabricated infractions. The boy's natural curiosity, once a sign of intelligence, was twisted into perceived disobedience. Each minor violation was catalogued, carefully framed, and presented to the uncle as proof of rebellion or incompetence. By this stage, the young heir's ability to distinguish truth from deception had been systematically dismantled. He could no longer rely on instinct or judgment. Everything in his life was filtered through the lens of fear the uncle had created. The betrayal escalated when one of the few individuals the boy still trusted, a distant cousin or a loyal tutor, was revealed to have been feeding information to the uncle. The child's hope of refuge was annihilated in an instant. This act of treachery was psychologically devastating. The young heir, already living in a state of constant paranoia, now faced the horrifying reality that loyalty was an illusion. Every familiar face, every comforting word, became suspect. The palace, which should have been a sanctuary, had transformed into a labyrinth of deceit and danger. With this network of betrayal established, the uncle moved decisively. He manipulated legal and ceremonial structures to corner the heir into compliance. Public accusations, fabricated evidence, and orchestrated testimonies converged to present the boy as a danger to the realm, as someone whose mere existence threatened the stability of the dynasty. No one dared intervene. The fear of the uncle's wrath was far greater than any sense of justice. The young heir was surrounded, alone in a crowd that outwardly bowed but inwardly plotted under duress, and trapped by the very authority that should have protected him. In private, the uncle ensured that the boy's final days were a blend of humiliation and terror. He was confined, often in near darkness, where whispers of his impending punishment haunted every waking moment. Messages, meals, and minor comforts were withheld to intensify suffering. The heir, conditioned by years of psychological manipulation, experienced every threat as immediate and lethal. By the time the uncle delivered the ultimate blow, the boy's mind was already weakened, his spirit broken, and his body conditioned to accept punishment as inevitable. The betrayal was complete when the instruments of torture, carefully disguised as routine discipline, were administered. The young heir, exhausted by years of mental torment, succumbed quickly. His cries, echoing through the stone corridors, were recorded by chroniclers as evidence of the cruelty he endured, but the orchestrators remained invisible, leaving the legacy of deception intact. History would remember the death as tragic, but few would grasp the calculated orchestration that ensured its inevitability. This final act cemented the uncle's control, eliminated the threat to his authority, and left the court in a permanent state of fear. The boy's life, once full of potential and promise, was extinguished, not by sudden violence alone, but by years of meticulous planning, psychological manipulation, and ultimate betrayal. The young heir's death sent shockwaves through the royal court and across the kingdom, but what followed was an eerie blend of silence, fear, and forced normalization. The uncle, having secured his objective, presented a facade of grief and stability, concealing the deliberate orchestration of murder behind rituals of mourning. Publicly, the court lamented the loss of a promising heir. Privately, fear and suspicion permeated every hall and chamber. No one dared speak openly, as even a whispered accusation could provoke the wrath of the uncle, now positioned as both guardian and ruler. The impact on the royal lineage was immediate and profound. The dynastic continuity, once seemingly secure, became vulnerable to political exploitation. Foreign envoys watched the unfolding tragedy with calculated interest, documenting the boy's death in dispatches that subtly hinted at intrigue and foul play. These accounts, while veiled in diplomacy, would later become critical historical sources, offering glimpses into the machinations of power that contemporary chroniclers could not openly reveal. Within the court, alliances shifted overnight. Those who had once supported the young heir now sought favor with the uncle, their loyalties rewritten in the shadow of his authority. Beyond political consequences, the psychological toll on the surviving royal family was devastating. Siblings, cousins, and close attendants wrestled with guilt, fear, and grief. The palace, once a place of ritual and ceremony, became a house of whispered secrets and unspoken horrors. Stories of the heir's suffering circulated quietly, forming a dark oral history that underscored the fragility of life and the insidious nature of power. Childhood innocence, already fragile in the corridors of royalty, was shattered for all who had witnessed or intuited the betrayal. The kingdom at large absorbed the loss with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. Propaganda and carefully managed narratives framed the heir's death as a tragic accident or divine will, diverting attention from the uncle's culpability. Yet, rumors persisted. Peasants, merchants, and soldiers alike recounted tales of the heir's suffering and the sinister hand that orchestrated it. These stories, passed down in hushed tones, would endure as cautionary legends about ambition, cruelty, and the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. In the immediate aftermath, the uncle consolidated power ruthlessly. He eliminated potential rivals, restructured court positions, and ensured that all who had been loyal to the young heir were either neutralized or coerced into submission. His rule, though outwardly stable, was steeped in fear and paranoia, a reflection of the methods he had used to secure it. Every decision, every decree, carried the invisible weight of the heir's death, a reminder of the lengths to which the uncle would go to maintain control. Yet the most haunting aftermath was emotional and moral. Those who had observed the cruelty in secret, from servants to minor nobles, carried the memory like a silent wound. The young heir's life, extinguished before it could reach full potential, became a symbol of innocence destroyed by ambition. Stories of his bravery, kindness, and intelligence persisted, contrasting sharply with the dark reality of betrayal, leaving a legacy both inspiring and horrifying. The kingdom would continue, but the shadow of this tragedy lingered, shaping future decisions, alliances, and fears. The consequences of the heir's death rippled outward, leaving an indelible mark on the dynasty and all who remained under its watchful eye. The death of the young heir did not simply mark the end of a life. It reshaped the entire perception of power, trust, and survival within the royal family. For decades, the echoes of his torture and murder haunted the palace corridors, influencing decisions, marriages, and alliances. Every member of the court became acutely aware that proximity to the throne carried deadly risk. Fear was no longer a background emotion. It became the foundation upon which authority and loyalty were measured. Courtiers calculated their words carefully, observing every gesture of their sovereign and weighing it against the potential for sudden cruelty. The psychological imprint of the heir's suffering transformed the behavior of an entire generation, leaving the court perpetually tense, guarded, and paranoid. The uncle, now secure in his power, ruled with an iron fist masked by ceremonial grandeur. His rise was fueled not merely by ambition but by a mastery of terror. Those who had witnessed or suspected his role in the heir's demise became instruments in maintaining control. Political rivals learned to tread lightly, understanding that the absence of the young heir's protective influence rendered them vulnerable. Over time, this created a culture in which fear, rather than merit, dictated courtly success. Public celebrations, royal decrees, and ceremonial events all carried undercurrents of unease, as courtiers silently calculated how each moment might serve or endanger them. Beyond the palace walls, the tragedy entered the realm of legend. Folk stories of the tortured heir circulated among commoners, soldiers, and merchants, warning of unchecked ambition and the ruthless lengths to which those in power could go. These tales, often embellished, ensured that the young prince's suffering was remembered far more vividly than the sanitized accounts presented by official historians. Over generations, his story became a symbol of both innocence destroyed and tyranny unchecked, serving as a cautionary tale that transcended the specifics of his family or kingdom. The legacy extended to subsequent heirs as well. Those who ascended the throne after the tragedy did so under the invisible pressure of the heir's memory. The palace's architecture, security protocols, and even ceremonial procedures were influenced by the fear of sudden betrayal or violent power grabs. Tutors, guardians, and courtiers took extraordinary precautions, ensuring that no child of the dynasty would be left unprotected, or at least, that the appearance of protection would be maintained. The very notion of succession became intertwined with vigilance, suspicion, and control, all shadowed by the memory of the young prince's torment. Even centuries later, historians examining the lineage noted the subtle, pervasive consequences of the heir's demise. Decisions about marriage, alliances, and governance were filtered through the lens of this singular act of cruelty. The kingdom's political culture, scarred by the precedent of internal violence, became unusually cautious and conservative, a reflection of lessons learned through suffering rather than abstract strategy. The psychological imprint of fear endured, influencing rulers, advisors, and citizens alike. Ultimately, the heir's death served as a brutal lesson in the human cost of ambition. While his life was short, its consequences extended across generations, shaping the behavior of the living and coloring the memory of the dead. His story, one of innocence, betrayal, and cruelty, remained a testament to the dangers of unchecked power and the lasting scars left by human malice. The young prince, though silenced in life, spoke loudly through history, leaving a legacy defined by fear, caution, and the haunting shadow of what was lost. The young prince, though silenced in life, spoke loudly through history, leaving a legacy defined by fear, caution, and the haunting shadow of what was lost. The young prince, though silenced in life, spoke loudly through history, leaving a legacy defined by fear, caution, and the haunting shadow of what was lost.